Today, where are we on the US election? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, working on this post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And I'm joined today by Salvatore Babones. Hello, Salvatore.
Thanks, it's great to see you again.
And after all your extravaganzas on the ABC, I'm flattered that you've still got time for me.
I come to you first. The ABC takes the leftovers.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that, and it really is great to have you on the show. And of course, as our American in Oz, it's great to specifically talk about where we are on the US election.
I've got the pen to prove it.
Well, it must be right then. But my point really is there's a lot of sort of waffle around at the moment saying, you know, the US democratic system's falling apart and it's terrible. But isn't this just the normal process?
What, falling apart and terrible? Of course, that's the way America always is. We've been hearing that since the beginning of the Republic. I think it's now 220-something years of 230-something years of falling apart. And actually, if you go back and read accounts from the late 18th and early 19th century of the elections, you'll hear all the same things as we hear today. It's always been this way, and it probably always will be. That's democracy in action.
Yeah, and that is the point, isn't it? This is the process. You know, the process was designed to essentially have those checks and balances in place. So those people who are basically saying that somehow the whole thing is just falling apart, that's an overreach. Well,
not just checks and balances. Look, it is overwrought language. I mean, I saw today this incredible news that Trump supporters had stormed, and that was the word, stormed, an election counting center at the Michigan Convention Center. And I turned immediately to see the video because I thought, you know, you stormed the beaches in Normandy, right? I mean, that's what's. They were banging on the windows. Now, I don't endorse banging on the windows, but when people are broadcasting in the U.S., I mean, NBC as a Good Morning America, or ABC's Good Morning America, whatever NBC shows, they have these broadcasting booths at street level with soundproof windows because people always come and bang on the windows. They want to be on TV, right? I didn't break the windows when we've seen actual storming. For example, CNN headquarters was stormed a few months ago. Well, they were smashing the windows of the CNN headquarters to get in. There was a guy with a skateboard whacking it against the windows, shattering this, shatterproof glass, if that's not an oxymoron. In Michigan, they were making noise. Well, okay, I don't think it's a good thing to do. I wouldn't go annoy the election workers, make their job even more difficult. But in a country where everyone has a constitutional right to an AK-47, banging on the windows is pretty mild behavior.
Right, yeah. And so, we are in the middle of a process at the moment. We're recording this on Thursday evening, right?
And you mentioned checks and balances. And I think a lot of people mistake that because they read too much Montesquieu. And Montesquieu's idea of checks and balances really came from his own misunderstanding of the British system, and this idea that the House or a House of Commons would check the House of Lords, which checks the King, and they all balance each other out. And that was very influential. And actually, America was set up that way. But in fact, in a two-party system, none of that really matters. The real check and balance we have in the United States is our system of federalism. The fact that the United States is a federal republic, as is Australia, although the United States is much more decentralized than Australia. And so we have 50 states in the District of Columbia, each running their own elections. Remember, there is no presidential election this week in the United States. There are 51 presidential elections this week in the United States, each of them with its own rules, each of them apportioning votes as it chooses. We often hear, why don't we just have a popular vote for the presidency? Well, that's because 48 states have chosen not to have a popular vote for the presidency. 2 of them have chosen hybrid systems where there's a winner take all for the 2 Senate votes, and then a winner-take-all for each of the congressional districts in the state. Those are Nebraska and Maine. The other states have winner-take-all for the whole state, but that's a state decision. And in fact, there is a constitutional amendment making the rounds that says that, if all the other states will go to popular vote to give away all of their electors that way, we'll do it too. But that's never garnered enough states to make it into the Constitution. So, it's the states that decide how they're running elections. The federal government is it's just that, federal.
Right. So it's really a passenger waiting to see what happens.
Well, I mean, that's too strong. I mean, I'm stating the case more strongly than it really is. The federal government, for the last 50 years, has gotten deeply involved in elections with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act that ensure that people have the ability to vote. The federal government has prohibited poll taxes. The federal government has prohibited literacy tests for voting. If there are cases where people of color are systematically, not just color, any minorities are systematically denied their ability to vote, the federal government will step in to enforce those federal rules. But that just sets the broad, fair playing field. How the states use it is really up to them, and states use it very differently. Oregon has complete voting by mail for everybody. Other states require that as in Australia, that you can only request an absentee ballot if you have a reason, and if you don't have a reason, you have to vote in person. Some states require that absentee ballots be postmarked by Election Day. Some require they be received by Election Day. Some require that they be included a security envelope inside the main envelope. Some don't. Some, like Florida, which 20 years ago, Florida had the worst election system in the country, and thus we had the Bush versus Gore case to the Supreme Court. Now Florida actually has electronic scanners for absentee ballots that scan for a signature. If it can't match the signature, they actually then notify people, telling them, please come submit a new ballot because your ballot didn't scan properly. In other states, if it's not signed, well, it's not signed, doesn't count. So we have 50 state systems in a District of Columbia system, and the only one that is ultimately run by the federal government is that DC system.
How interesting, right. And the other point that came out, I think, in a lot of the coverage was that Biden and Trump's approaches were quite different. So, Trump was really local in terms of getting the people to sign up and to vote. Biden was more using media and advertising, spent a large amount, but didn't do much on the ground. Is that a true reflection, do you think, of what happened? Or is that, again, an overlay?
Well, that's a pattern that's evolved the last 20 years. It used to be that the Democrats were the party of the solid ground game. And the reason was that the Democrats were closely connected with the union movement, and the union movement provided the labor for that ground game. Unlike in Australia and the UK, where unions make big political donations, in the US, the impact of unions on elections has been getting out the vote. Unions have volunteered for that ground game. Now, as unions have declined in the United States, I mean, at this point, I think something like 13% of workers are unionized, and in the private sector, it's down in the single digits. That workforce for the Democratic Party has largely evaporated, and Republicans have now become the party of the ground game, the party with lots of volunteers who do that door-to-door, door knocking and making sure that people receive their ballots, making sure people have all the opportunity to vote that they need. And, that has shifted from one side to the other. Now, it's not all, motherhood and apple pie on the Republican side. The Republican side also has a ground game for preventing people from voting. And I won't say obstructing, because that's a legal term, but discouraging, preventing. Republicans, for example, routinely use election observers at polling places to attempt to slow down the line at the polling places, so that in Democratic majority districts, people have to wait longer to vote because somebody is challenging asking for proof for every single voter. That slows it down, that discourages people from voting. So the Republicans at the local level are both doing more to get out the vote and more to, frankly, suppress the vote. We're waiting for a likely Biden victory. Now, if you interviewed me 24 hours ago, I would have said we're waiting for a likely Trump victory. It all comes down to these razor thin margins in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, where 10,000 votes either way may make the difference. And 10,000 votes either way sounds like, well, how could you miscount 10,000 votes? But if you look at it in percentage terms, it's a quite small percentage. And in fact, easily you could have that many votes, a single malfunctioning counting machine. So there's your 10,000 votes right there, right? Now, if the votes were all randomly sorted, if the votes were going through in a randomized order, then of course we would have much less reason to worry that some kind of error or administrative failure would swing the election. But of course, they're not coming in a randomized order. They're coming in mail-in ballots, primarily strongly favoring Joe Biden, the in-person ballots primarily supporting Donald Trump, ballots from big cities mainly supporting Joe Biden, ballots from suburban and rural areas mainly supporting Donald Trump. So they're clumped together, which means if there's just one lost mailbag from one town in Michigan, that's the election right there.
Right, and it does come down to the wire quite often. This isn't the first time, is it, that it's been played?
It's not the first time. I mean, we had the Bush versus Gore election most famously in 2000 that went on for, 17 days or something. In fact, the states have 5 weeks to certify their results, so there's not that much of a rush, really. They have to certify it's December 8th. They have to certify results December 14th. The electors have to meet and actually vote in the Electoral College. So there's really plenty of time. There's no rush. I think on the one hand, Donald Trump's demands that counting stop are clearly undemocratic. Why not count votes that were validly cast? On the other hand, Democratic demands that we not have lawsuits this time, well, again, are undemocratic. I mean, of course, if a recount is mandated, have a recount. If in fact ballots have been processed in a way that they shouldn't have been processed, well, we'd like scrutiny of that, right? So I think everyone just needs to sit tight. We don't need an election result tonight, tomorrow, this week. We just need an election result by December 8th, and really by December 14th is the true deadline in from a constitutional standpoint. So, sit tight, relax, and enjoy the show.
Oh, I have been. It's been wall to wall, so it's hard to avoid it. But one other question I have for you is the blue states and the red states, right? I mean, that map's quite interesting. It seems to me that there's quite a significant restructuring between the two, right? So you've got the two edges of the country, which is one color, and
right.
The chunk in the middle is the other color. Has that always been the case, or is that essentially marking some sort of delineation between those two different groups?
So first I should tell the story of how they became blue and red states, because they weren't always. If you look at older maps, generally Democrats would be marked as red because they're associated with socialism, and thus Republicans associated with conservative blue. And in Europe, red is the radical left, blue is the conservative right. It got reversed in America in 2000, because in 2000 we had our first contested election in a long time, and crucially, our first internet election. And at that time, the leading website was the New York Times website, and increasingly people turned to that New York Times website, and the graphic designer at the New York Times had no sense of history, just thought, well, R for Republican, R for red. And the person made the Republicans red and the Democrats blue. And because that map at the New York Times was referred to endlessly on the internet, they became afterwards the red states and the blue states, which is really funny. Really what we have in the US, though, are two permanent classes, social classes that are represented by the two parties, not two groups of states. Those classes are the Republicans have always represented small business people, farmers, large farmers, not farm workers, commercial farmers, entrepreneurs. Those people have overwhelmingly voted Republican for a long time. The Democratic Party has been the party of labor, including farm laborers. It's also been the party of the plutocrats. So the big New York bankers and the big financiers have been Democrats, this kind of alliance between very relatively rich and very poor. And then both parties have had professionals in some kind of relatively even split. What's happened over the last, 50 years or so is that professionals, members of the people with university advanced degrees who work in the professions, have overwhelmingly tilted into the Democratic Party. So we've seen one class tacked onto the Democratic Party. And that's why the Democratic Party has such a deep internal division, because the Democratic Party now consists of a radically progressive group and a group of ordinary professionals who are not so radically progressive. And you can think of this as the Clinton versus Bernie Sanders wings of the Democratic Party. And it's an uneasy alliance between these two groups, whereas the Republican Party is much more unified. It's still the same group. Now, geographically, if you put that onto states, the big change, of course, was the Nixon Southern strategy, where the solid South, which was formerly the solid Democratic South, coming out of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the South was, Lincoln was the party, the Republicans were the party of Lincoln, the party of abolitionism. It was actually started by abolitionists, and so thus had no presence in the South. Nixon decided to make the Republican Party a Southern party. The Southern Democrats were pushed out by these new professionals. As professionals joined the Democratic Party, they were very uncomfortable with the frankly racist Southern white core of the Democratic Party. And so those segregationists in the Democratic, and let's not forget, they were explicitly segregationists who wanted segregation between black and white, and had it up until the late 1960s. They were forced out of the Democratic Party as the professionals poured into the Democratic Party, and they migrated to the Republican Party. Now, today, you won't find a lot of segregationists in any party in the US. I don't even think you'll find a lot of racists. I think the claims of racism are really overblown. But whereas once the South was traditionally Democratic, now people in the South think they're traditionally Republican. And that's been the only big geographical shift. Otherwise, the upper Midwest, the Plains states, those have been Republican since the 1850s, since the party was founded. The Northeast has been Democratic leaning since the big waves of immigration in the 1870s, 1880s. So things have been very stable, like I said, except for that switch of the solid South.
Right. That's very interesting once again, because, the idea that there is a history, right, which explains how we get to is, again, not well told, right? And that's important to understand how you get to where you get to.
Yeah. I mean, you can go back a long way in history, and you won't find a lot of Kansas Democrats. Go all the way back to the Civil War. They're few. They're here and there. There was the progressive movement came out of Kansas, but those plains and mountain states, Wyoming, Montana, have always been solidly Republican.
Right. And so I guess, the message from the conversation today is that this is relatively normal. The process will continue. We'll get to see the result sometime, maybe a few days, maybe even a few weeks. Doesn't really matter. And we should just sit back and let it happen because, processes are just running.
Well, and I really mean it when I say enjoy the show, because we have this great spectacle of democracy that, while it seems most of my fellow Americans are embarrassed by it, I'm very proud of it. I think it is an example to the world. And whereas lots of Americans hold their heads and say, oh, this is so embarrassing, I think, no, this shows democracy in action when it's hard fought. I mean, I said on on TV earlier this week that there's, every U.S. election is incredibly hard fought. They're razor thin margins. People are desperate to do any one last little thing they can do for their constituents in order to get elected. And it doesn't matter. I mean, if you have some small group, if you have a congregation of a few hundred people in a relatively unknown religious sect, candidate will come talk to you and ask you what your concerns are for your community, because they're looking to pick up that 100 votes here, 100 votes there for Congress, certainly for state level elections. And that kind of responsiveness is the strength of the American system. Now, it does make it highly combative, but being highly combative is how you get that fantastic level of constituent representation that you really do see in the United States. I mean, if you think about it as in the marketplace for anything else, you don't want all of the leading companies to work together to provide the best possible service for you. You want all the leading companies to be fighting it out for your consumer dollar. Well, that's the way I see politics. And I'm very happy that we back in the US do have that kind of politics.
Well, I appreciate your time today, Salvatore. And let's have a separate conversation about some of the implications if there is a change, because I think that'll be an interesting conversation point. But I think that point of yours today is really important, that nothing really is off the scale here. This is just a normal set of processes. We'll get to a result. It's all open in the open and a lot of stuff going on, but just sit back and enjoy the show. Great advice.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. See you next time.